They needed to understand that whenever the Labor Party said, oh no, we don't want to talk about culture, maybe you should talk about culture. If the other side doesn't want you to talk about it, maybe you should.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Well, welcome to Afternoon Light Live from the Robert Menzies Institute. This is our 6th Afternoon Light Live, and today we are diving into a very timely and important topic, elections, Menzies, of course, and where to next for liberalism. Well, the federal election is done and dusted. Most of the results are in, although there are a couple of stragglers and a few tight contests that still remain to be decided. But the Labor government, led by, of course, Anthony Albanese, has been emphatically returned for a second term. So far, Labor holds 93 seats to the Coalition's 43. This has been a pretty dramatic election. The Greens suffered a major setback, being reduced to just one seat in the House of Reps. And the Teals managed to hold almost all their seats except for one, maintaining 9 seats that they had in the 2022 election. Labor's victory marks the biggest win for a sitting government since Malcolm Fraser's landslide in 1975, and it's the highest number of seats since John Howard won in 1996. Notably, it's the first time since World War II that a government has increased its majority while seeking a second term. This is a stunning turnaround considering just a month ago we were wondering whether Albanese's government would go the way of James Scullin's one and done. Here at the Robert Menzies Institute, of course, we love our history, so it's a real pleasure to be joined today by our resident historian, Dr. Zachary Gorman. Hi, Zach.
Hi.
I'm also delighted to welcome John Roskam, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Welcome, John.
Hello, Georgina. Hello, Zach.
Lovely to have you here at the University of Melbourne.
Where I spent far too many years back in the day.
Yes, your old stomping ground. And we're very lucky to have a protest outside as well today. Not about us, thankfully. Together, we will unpack the past, we'll interpret the present, and we'll hazard a guess at what the future is for Australian liberalism. So, John, the election. Was it a surprise or was it just as you'd expect?
No, sadly, Georgina, it wasn't a surprise. I wrote in my Substack that I actually bet on the Coalition losing seats, on the government forming a majority. I didn't think that the devastation would be as great as it was. A few things didn't surprise me. Being a Melburnian and being good friends with Tim Wilson, I saw how effective a hyper-local campaign can be. So we could perhaps talk about that. I live in Kooyong, and Amelia Hamer, of course, has come very close to winning, unsuccessfully as she was. But sadly, I wasn't surprised.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I wasn't surprised either. I also live in Kooyong, and Amelia did an extremely good job at campaigning, but there's still a lot of, you can tell, support for the Teal movement.
And it's interesting in this day of digital communications, of us being connected to each other through our devices, the most effective thing that Tim Wilson did, that the Greens did 3 years ago, that Amelia did in Kooyong, was door knocking, getting volunteers out, talking to your neighbours, talking to your friends and being seen and being about. And it's nice, there's still some aspects of democratic politics that live in 2025, like going out and meeting voters.
Yeah, novel idea really, but still works. John, in February, and we came out of Christmas and went through summer and got to February, and all the pollsters and pundits were saying, oh, the Coalition's going to win, the polls are looking very strong for Dutton. If they don't win, it'll be, minority government. Labor might just be able to scrape through with help of the Teals and the Greens. But suddenly, 2 months later, the situation is entirely different. What happened, do you think, to lead to such a deterioration?
That's a key question, and we know that's what Liberals are asking themselves. I think, Georgina, there were a couple of things happening. One is that while there was dissatisfaction with the Albanese government, that was reflected months ago in a vote for Peter Dutton. But then as we got closer to the election, people have to choose in our compulsory system. I describe it as a choice between arsenic and cyanide. And when they were given the option, the Labor Party and the way the Labor Party framed the campaign as a cost of living election, where basically it was a competition between which side gave you the biggest handouts, I think that was always going to come to be in Labor's favour. And then the other thing is, and subsequent to the election, talking to Liberals, talking to my Labor friends, even Labor are surprised at how successful their negative campaigning against Peter Dutton and the coalition was. The Medicare scare campaign that we've seen now a couple of versions of was hugely successful. Nuclear energy, again, became an election issue, not interestingly because of its safety concerns necessarily, but because this amount of $600 billion became embedded in the public mind. So I think the polls were always going to tighten, and we got the result that we did.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it is worth reflecting, though, that Labor has won 93 seats. We'll see what the final number ends up being, I guess, next week. But with just 34.5% primary, the Liberals had 32% primary, Liberals and Nationals, sorry, the coalition, and then the rest was 33.2. So it's, a third, right? So this is preference flows that have delivered this thumping victory to Labor, not an emphatic swell of support towards the Labor Party.
I don't completely share this view of preferences. I would argue that if the Greens didn't exist, that first preference would go to the Labor Party. I'm more inclined to look at the share of the centre-left and hard-left first preference votes and the centre-right and right first preference votes. And I think the share of seats in the lower house certainly does, from my perspective, sadly reflect, I think, where the Australian public is at. We can have a discussion as to whether proportional representation is something the Liberals should push for or first past the post. But I think this share of the seats in the House that Labor has is about where the Australian public is.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting analysis. I know we've talked, Zach, about how the right-wing minor parties, their votes matched about the vote of the Greens, about 12% apiece. But if you then consider the teal vote, some of the independent votes as being in the sort of centre-left bucket, then you've seen that primary vote pushing 60%, aren't you?
I mean, for me, just on that, the thing that struck me most one of the things is the very low turnout. We are looking at potentially the lowest turnout since the introduction of compulsory voting. A
lot of people getting that $50 fine, John.
That's right. A lot of apathy.
Zach, how unprecedented, though, is it to have this a third? So a third going to independents, minor parties?
It is completely without precedent since the birth of the original two-party system in 1909. This has never happened before. It's very reminiscent of the 1903 election result that Alfred Deakin famously labelled the 311s, implying that you can't play cricket with three teams. We don't have three teams at the moment. The preference flows and how it's broken down in individual seats has meant that Labor has this overwhelming majority. But what that overwhelming majority masks is that the trend is continuing. The trend is continuing of people who don't like either of the major parties. Even though it didn't shake out this time, the likelihood of minority governments and hung parliaments and all the rest of that is only increasing. And that happens because both major parties are unpopular. This is not just the Liberals that are unpopular. I mean, Labor were almost 2 points below where they were in 2004 when Latham's handshake lost them the election in that landslide. If the Liberals want to have any sort of solace, they did at least do better than the UAP in 1943, which again speaks to the fact that it is both sides whose primary vote has really tanked.
Yeah, so the Liberals' primary vote, we just said, or the coalition's is 32% this election. In 1943, the UAP, I think was it 30.44? It got at the 43 election, and then it was disbanded as a political party. So anyway, draw what conclusion you would like from that. Zach, in 1909, when we sort of first see the two-party system emerge in Australia, and of course it goes through different iterations as the centre-right evolves, it was the joining together of sort of two parts of the centre-right to solidify that. I mean, is there a lesson we can learn from that time that maybe gives the two-party system, I guess, some hope, or are we really going to see a future where minor parties' independents are going to become more and more of a political force? I mean, I do have the figures here of just the last three elections. In 2019, 25.22% voted for a minor party, an independent. 22, it was 31.72. This election, 33.2. So it's going up quite neatly. There's sort of no hesitation with this trajectory.
Well, I always say that the fact that we end up with a Labor versus Liberal political divide before the First World War, and then it's sort of interrupted by the First World War and the Great Depression and comes back towards the end of the Second World War, suggests that these are the sort of natural fault lines of Australian politics, that our centre-right always has to incorporate these ideals of liberalism and individual freedom and all the rest of it. That is what defines the Australian centre-right. It's called the Liberal Party for a reason. It's not a mistake that it's called so. But another lesson in 1909 that's probably a less inspirational lesson is that nothing quite unites the Liberals as their opposition to Labor. They were protectionists and free traders who disagreed philosophically on an awful lot of things, but they agreed that Labor's form of socialism was too much even for the protectionists, and they were hell-bent on protecting the Constitution. That's the other thing that really united them, was all the referendums that the early Labor Party was pushing, because let's not forget that the Labor Party had opposed federation. They were never happy with our Constitution.
Yeah. John, you spoke about the nuclear policy. I mean, that was one of the policies I really liked, and I was excited that the coalition was pushing that last year, but it did seem to just be put in sort of the back shelf of the pantry and hidden away with the, out-of-date spices that you hadn't touched in 16 years. So what happened?
Have you looked into my pantry lately? That's exactly the case.
Has those out-of-date spices, and I feel like poor little nuclear energy was with them. Tell me, was it because the coalition got to, I mean, we're speculating, we weren't inside the campaign room, but was it because the coalition got to February and thought, look, it's going really well, but there's a bit of nervousness, squeamishness about nuclear, so let's go small target and safe and just campaign on cost of living and 25-cent fuel excise cut? Or was this a missed opportunity that we could have had a genuine policy debate, a big ideas policy debate that represented two different visions of Australia?
Key question. Before I answer that, can I come to one of the issues that Zach raised, which is the fault lines are right and left, but it's also the case that compulsory voting, laws of public funding, our entire political system structures our politics to be Liberal versus Labor. And one of the things that's happening is I think the Australian public is frustrated with that two-party system. So someone like me, for example, that opposes government censorship, that's deeply concerned about the ban on social media for under 16s, that believes in the repeal of Section 18C, that doesn't like the misinformation laws first supported by the Liberal Party, is increasingly homeless in our two-party system. So people will look to alternatives, whether on the right or the left. But to come to your question, Georgina, about nuclear power, my view has always been nuclear power was the coalition's second best option. Most of the coalition party room would like to dump net zero tomorrow. It was forced upon them by Scott Morrison. As Matt Canavan has been saying since the election, the coalition's support of net zero has failed dismally as an election policy, and the nuclear policy of Dutton's was a way of avoiding a net zero discussion, which would have split the party room, certainly, and presented a policy that, and at least initially, most of the public supported. But I think the public, to their credit, also understand that nuclear power is expensive. It's not as expensive as $600 billion, but it will cost a lot of money, and it's a long way into the future. And it was becoming less of an electoral asset as time went on. And the other thing, and this applies to discussion about nuclear policy, about any of the positive policies that the coalition had. The coalition had a series of good education policies as well. But there was a very strong feeling, and I had a senior shadow minister say this to me, Georgina, some 6 months ago. And they were committed to good policy too, but they said any policy that we put forward will detract from our attacks on Labor.
Right.
That was the problem, but they forgot that it's not just one thing for voters to not like Labor. You actually, as Zach was pointing out, you have to get people to like you or at least dislike you less.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen.
No, well, it clearly did not happen. But I did think that there wasn't a baseball bat out for Albo.
No, there wasn't.
Yeah.
That's right.
There definitely was for Scott Morrison in 2022.
It was for Keating in 96.
That's right. So without a baseball bat, you weren't going to get a Labor government ceremoniously turfed out after one term in office. The other thing is there was no offering of a plan for the future from the coalition, a clear plan. It's like the only thing I can really remember is the 25-cent fuel excise cut.
And talking to candidates on the ground, a lot of the public didn't even know about that policy either.
Right.
Because it came relatively late. And again, talking to candidates, and this is one of the challenges of campaigning, they had printed all their material and then at the last minute the coalition has a 25-cent per litre fuel excise cut and they can't even tell the public about it because you can't go on legacy media and tell people because increasingly they're not tuning into legacy media.
Zach, we have compulsory voting in Australia. We've had that since the 1920s and we've done a podcast on that. So we can put that in a link in the recording of this because it's a really interesting history. But what about compulsory preferences? And do you think they have always favoured the centre-left or has there been occasions when they've been favouring the other side of politics?
Well, compulsory preferences are an attempt by the centre-right to find a solution to the cult of independence and the fact that Liberals tend to herd about as well as cats. I mean, the Liberal Party and the Liberal side of Australian politics are ultimately the successors to their 19th century counterparts who worked without political parties, who were all elected as vague Liberals, but then got to decide on each individual issue which way they would sit. And obviously, once Labor comes along, has the caucus pledge and this really harsh party discipline, that's not going to cut it. So they try to find a solution, which is forcing compulsory preferences. It's first raised by the first majority Liberal government of Joseph Cook just before the war and ultimately introduced by Billy Hughes just after the war, basically to combat the rise of the Country Party, who's going to split the centre-right vote in all these rural seats and decimate the number of nationalists in Parliament. But it probably does the opposite to some extent because once you have preferences, now it's a lot easier to vote for the Country Party because you don't feel like you're giving Labor an unfair advantage by doing so.
Do you think we should get rid of them?
I do as a matter of philosophy. I favour optional voting, voluntary voting, and I favour optional preferential. If you want to number every box, go for it. If you just want to number one box, you should. And again, this is the conflict of politics versus principle. Like most of the Liberal party room would favour some form of voluntary voting, but they also know that could drive their vote down even further. And so I would argue against their conscience sometimes to support compulsory voting. I mean, I would get rid of compulsory voting. I'd get rid of public funding for political parties. Why should my taxpayers' dollars fund the Greens? A party that I am absolutely opposed to in every sense. But the major parties think it's in their interests to do so.
Yeah, and I mean, even the Teals were, I think, quite rightly concerned about funding caps.
They were, and they're right to be.
As you say, favour incumbents, favour the two major parties.
And funding caps favour the left because the funding caps don't encompass voluntary contributions of time. They don't encompass the support of left-wing legacy media. For the centre-right, for the Teals, for independents, money is the only way that some of that playing field can be balanced up. But again, the Liberal Party caved in to the Labor Party because the Labor Party said, well, if you don't do a deal with us, we'll do a deal with the Greens and we'll even make it worse.
It's interesting. The Teals obviously have been a really recent phenomenon. They have been empowered by a huge influx of funds from people like Simon Holmes à Court, of course, but other sort of fellow travellers.
And foreign money sometimes too.
But, there is also a squeamishness in the electorate about money in politics. And so, I wonder how people who are sick of the major parties, they're cynical about the major parties, they're supporting the Teal candidates. But, how do you marry those two positions? Because the Teals are only there because of money. But if you don't like money in politics and you think it's a little bit distasteful.
That's the great irony. And,
money.
From my perspective, if you're going to regulate money, then you have to regulate the voluntary time of retired public servants door knocking for Teals and getting swamped in electorates like Kooyong and Goldstein and Wentworth by people on defined public superannuation schemes who have all this time on their hands.
John, how do you classify the policies that Peter Dutton and the coalition took to the election in terms of their ideology? Are we talking about stock standard Australian liberalism, or was it a sort of a, I guess, national conservatism? Was it definitely not libertarian? But do you have a categorisation, or do you think it was just
It was a mishmash. It wasn't Trumpian. John Keogh in the Australian Financial Review pointed out that the coalition's economic policy offerings were some of the most left-wing offered by any party in recent times. I think it was just a testament to the ideological incoherence of where the Liberal Party was in 2025.
What about you, Zach? You're a student of Australian liberalism from its early iteration in the 19th century. Did you see any echoes of Australian liberalism in the Dutton agenda?
No, I think that the 25-cent fuel voucher was such an epitome of the choice you was describing between cyanide and whatever it is. Arsenic. Because if you look at it, how could the Liberals mount a legitimate economic case against things like rebates for the power prices when their offer was just another temporary sugar hit? And the fact that the Liberals allowed themselves, however far off, however small those tax cuts may have been, but the fact that the Liberals allowed themselves to become the party of larger taxes when, again, that's probably one of the things that unites a free trader or a protectionist, outside of obviously tariffs are taxes, Donald Trump, is that you want lower taxes and you want economic growth on the basis of encouraging businesses because there are lower taxes.
It was a criticism from, I guess, the left, at least the left-wing media, but also the Labor Party and Greens were throwing this at Dutton, that Dutton was injecting Trump-style
I wish he had.
Into Australia.
There was none of that.
So, as an observer of Trump-style politics, what part of his campaign and his rhetoric did you think was Trumpian, or was it was just an
unfortunately, none of it. So he certainly appointed Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price in a role of looking at government efficiency, but she didn't have enough time to undertake that responsibility. I think it is clear from talking to candidates and looking at the early poll data that Trump was an effect. But it wasn't an effect that people thought Peter Dutton was Donald Trump. It was something that contributed to instability, uncertainty, unease. And again, when the Labor Party was doing everything it could to calm the Australian public, it's clear that Donald Trump's presence and certainly his tariff announcements did support the Labor Party, but there was nothing remotely Trumpian about the coalition offering.
Zach, outside of world wars, which of course are a massive, massive impact on politics and democracy, have there been international events that have impacted Australian elections like the Trump effect did, the Liberation Day tariffs and all the complications on our domestic politics?
Well, I'd agree with John that it is this underlying instability, and there's something that Australians sort of crave is stability and continuity. We are ultimately refugees from the west of the world who left the old country where it was all awful and people had sectarian strife and there were intermittent wars and all the rest of it. And we just want to be left alone at the ends of the earth. And at time it contributed, certainly for Menzies' benefit, was it, say, in 1963, you had the JFK assassination. It really contributed to the scale of the swing back towards the government. But I would say that it's interesting that even though we're impacted by these international trends, we always interpret them in a very Australian way. And I think probably the most classic example of that is that we had the Thatcher-Reagan era reforms introduced by the Hawke Labor government and sort of done in this consensus politics way. It wasn't the Iron Lady absolutely forcing them through against all this screams and opposition. It was actually Hawke trying to get everyone to sit down in a room and sort of negotiate it through. So we always twist things in our own way because we do have our own political culture, and even the rise of the internet and all the rest of it, we're still ultimately Australians.
I wonder, Zach, though, if you'd comment on the Petrov affair. I mean, the 1950s, it's height of the Cold War. I mean, Petrov affair was obviously happened here in Australia, but it was an international influence on our democracy. I mean, that type of Cold War influence on our politics, I mean, arguably, Robert Menzies was able to win so many elections because of that threat of communism from abroad, and you know, he was seen as the bulwark against it, along with the DLP.
Yeah, the impacts of Petrov on the 1954 election is one of the biggest ongoing debates in Australian political history. It was so shocking that the opposition leader, Herbert Evatt, literally went mad over it. He thought the election had been stolen from him. He lost his marbles. He presented Molotov's letter in the middle of the Australian Parliament.
For those who are not familiar with the Petrov affair, Molotov was the Soviet foreign minister who, when asked by Doc Evatt, the opposition leader, whether the Soviet Union had any KGB agents in Australia, said no, of course not. And Doc Evatt held this letter up as sort of evidence that, of course, we don't have Soviet agents, which, anyway, it spoke for itself, really, of his descent into madness.
Yeah, and the same Molotov known for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where the USSR teamed up with Hitler to invade Poland. So a really reputable character whose word could be taken as the gospel truth. But Petrov almost was a compliment to Australia as well, that the Russians actually cared about us, that we weren't some backwater, that they were actually bothering to sort of tap our phones and trying to wield influence within Australia. And it certainly built up the case that Menzies had been prosecuting for a long time at this point, that yes, the Reds, communism, this global force was really trying to have this reach that went so far that it even reached us here in the Antipodes.
And what's interesting about that is the Cold War didn't necessarily have to disadvantage centre-left parties. So in 1960, Kennedy won as a bigger Cold War warrior than Nixon. And he went to the American public saying, oh, look, Eisenhower hasn't taken the threat seriously. So it was partly Menzies' genius as a statesman and as a politician winning elections in the 60s, but it was also a testament to the failure of Labor's response to the threat of communism.
Now, we're now 1 minute into our audience Q&A time, so I don't want to be greedy and take up more of it. I've got lots of questions here. I've got a question from Peter. What happened to the "we believe" statement, I think he means? How come the Liberal candidates never mention it? I did notice on the radio, I think it was yesterday, the Vice President of the Liberal Party, Fiona Scott, she mentioned it a lot. The "we believe" statement, I think, Zach's going to correct me, was first written by the federal president of the Liberal Party in 1954 for the 10th anniversary of the Liberal Party. Have I got that right so far, Zach? And then it was reissued, I think, in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of the Liberal Party with sort of more contemporary language because some of it had dated a bit. It's a statement of values. John, you're a long-time Liberal Party member. I mean,
some 35 years,
perhaps
I think.
An uncomfortable membership for you on many occasions. But I mean,
it's uncomfortable when I lose pre-selection, definitely.
Maybe if you quoted the "we believe" statement more, you would win pre-selection.
There's a couple of things. I mean, the "we believe" statement sits at odds with many of the coalition's policies, as Zach was outlining, and not just these policies, but previous policies over the last decade or so, there's a tension between the Liberal Party and all political parties wanting to choose local candidates. And we've just talked about the importance of local campaigning and hyper-local campaigning. So the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, the Teals will want someone who's connected to their community. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're steeped in Liberal values. And we all know the situations of people having been Liberal Party members for 5 minutes before they become Liberal Party MPs. So it's a tension for someone like me. I don't believe that everyone needs to have, and I'm looking at David Kemp's wonderful history of democracy and liberalism in Australia. I don't think every Liberal MP or candidate needs to have read all 5 volumes, but some of them should have. Some of them should have read, Zach's book. Some of them, should be reading that.
Forgotten People broadcast.
We've gone, I'd argue we've gone too far the other way. We've got too many great local candidates who've been local councillors or mayors or community champions, and we need that, but we don't have anyone who could tell you about the forgotten people speech other than perhaps give us a sentence.
Yes. The Holmes material, Holmes spiritual. Yeah, but probably not much more
Lifters
than that.
and leaners, that's about all they know.
Yeah. A question from Professor Timothy Lynch, Robert Menzies Institute board member. So I better read out Tim's question. Thank you, Tim. Was the ALP much cannier in dealing with the Trump effect? Albanese evidently watched how Trump prospered as an anti-woke warrior. He determined he would not offer Dutton that target. He campaigned from the Labor centre. He eschewed cultural issues. He dropped the voice like a stone. And he did, actually. Yeah, he left Dutton few things to throw back at him. What do you think?
What a wonderful question.
Oh, very good question.
From the professor. No, I think that's right. There's a few things the Liberals were certainly scared off talking about any aspect of culture. It was hugely significant that a couple of days before the election, just after Peter Dutton had made a reference to woke education, he was then asked to follow up, and then he quickly backtracked and said, no, I'm not going to talk about that because he literally said, because research tells us people only want us to talk about cost of living. Now, from my perspective, the Liberals can certainly talk about cost of living and education at the same time. You could tell the uncertainty about welcome to country. Peter Dutton, I think, had 3 or 4 different positions in the course of 5 days. The Labor Party at every level was cannier. I know that Peter Dutton was advised to attack Donald Trump, to neutralise some of those attacks from Labor. He didn't. I don't know whether that would have worked anyway. I think the Trump effect is one of those circumstances and events that invade a political campaign that are hard to plan for, and one side will have some luck and the other side won't.
It is interesting, Tim's point about Albanese dumping the voice in terms of, he just says it's done, it's over. And I mean, yes.
But the Liberals and Peter Dutton let him do it.
Yeah. But I mean, Penny Wong did say one day we'll get something, but it was sort of,
so from my perspective,
clean campaign.
And the Liberals fell into that. So the Liberals believed the Labor line that this was only a cost of living campaign. Okay, and so in a cost of living campaign, when the competition is between handouts, Labor wins. And then the other thing about the Liberal Party is they needed to understand that whenever the Labor Party said, oh no, we don't want to talk about culture, maybe you should talk about culture. If the other side doesn't want you to talk about it, maybe you should. And it was significant that Anthony Albanese went quiet on Welcome to Country at Anzac Day ceremonies. The Liberal Party, conservatism generally in Australia, has had one victory in the last 10 years, and I'd argue liberalism too, because it was about all Australians being equal. It was the voice, and the Liberal Party had no idea how to capitalise on that victory. Peter Dutton never spoke about the voice. I think he was personally uncomfortable talking about it because his view was that there should be a free vote amongst Liberal MPs, and he was forced into his position by the coalition party room. And this goes to a much bigger question, and we're seeing it now. You've got Liberal MPs and senators saying that the Liberals shouldn't talk about culture, whereas, as Janet Albrighton has pointed out, everything is culture.
Yeah. Zach, from a historical point of view, the the win in a referendum and then the loss in an election is very much Doc Evatt. In the 51 referendum, he defeats Menzies, who's wanting to change the constitution to ban communism, but then never can win an election against him. So there's sort of echoes of that. I'd love your thoughts on whether that's what we're seeing with the Liberals. Have they become the Evatt Labor Party? Oh, God. And then the other thing I'd want your reflection on is you always talk about Menzies. It was so clear what he stood for. You know, you agreed with him or you didn't, but people respected that he had a clarity of belief and philosophy. And so he'd argue the case to the final vote in an election, and he was 7 times over successful in persuading people to vote more his way than the other way. I mean, is that, you know, that absolute belief in something and convincing people that you do believe in something, is that the sort of key to the future of liberalism?
Well, it's interesting with the referendums. Yes, referendums have a long history of not necessarily impacting the government that puts them up. I mean, we have a long history of really long-term governments who stay in power for a long time, and we have a long history of referendums failing. Those two things can't be true simultaneously unless people are able to separate them. And I think it's really important to note that Dutton never fought against the voice on first principles. It was never about liberalism. It was never about the basic equality of all citizens. It was always about unintended consequences and all this wishy-washy stuff, because the Liberal Party, as Damien Freeman, our fellow, would very well know, was heavily involved in designing the early stages of the voice. But I think the key thing about Menzies and the key thing about, say, a Howard, the key thing about successful Liberal politicians is that if you fight on an issue-by-issue basis, Liberals tend to lose. They end up getting in bidding wars on, say it's health, say it's education, say it's cost of living relief, whatever it may be. If you fight it just on that issue, it's really hard to mount the case. What you have to mount the case for is an overall approach to government, and then all the dominoes fit into place. We can't spend money here because the overall spending too much will increase taxation, increase debt. That will make less opportunity for your children, blah, 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 blah. It's about connecting it into this broader picture. And I think it's a skill that the modern Liberal Party has really lost.
I guess the last time we had that was the Howard headland speeches, was it?
Well, we did, and
we obviously had the Forgotten People
and the
podcast.
point about Menzies, the point about Howard, the point about Abbott to some extent is they had decades of arguing, reading, losing debates. One of the criticisms you get from MPs is that Peter Dutton emphasised unity, and that was at one level a good thing, but it also meant there was no debate and discussion. There was very little of testing of ideas. For someone like me of my generation, growing up in the Liberal Party, watching the fights between the wets and the dries, you had wets writing books, you had dries writing books, you had arguments, and then you talk to ministers in the Howard government, and they talked about how that then set the framework for the 90s. And since the end of Howard, other than Abbott and maybe one or two others, we haven't had any Liberal or Liberal leader doing anything like that.
Yeah, no, it's very true. They were the days, weren't they? The wets and the dries. I grew up with that, of course, in a house of a dry. A question from Julie. Thank you, Julie. How significant a factor is the failure of the Liberal Party to build a cohort of women as candidates in winnable seats? Has the success of so-called teal women damaged the Liberal Party by showing us there are competent women who didn't find a home in the Liberal Party? I'd be interested in your views on that, John.
Oh, look, I think the Liberal...
As someone, and you have been beaten at pre-selections by women.
And by men.
And by men.
So, look,
yes.
and so from my perspective, I think the Liberal Party has to connect with people of all backgrounds, genders and races. I think the argument that the Liberal Party has a women problem is exaggerated, as I think Peter Credlin pointed out. The highest recent vote for Liberals amongst women was from Tony Abbott. As Bree McKee at the IPA has pointed out, the idea that women should vote for women, I think, is the very worst form of identity politics. A good leader is a good leader. at the state level, when Liberals have tried women as leaders, as women, not as leaders, that hasn't particularly worked. I think the argument relates to more the impact of policies on families, the impact on working women and working men. So I think this is it's an argument to be had, but I think it's a bit more sophisticated than simply women versus men. The other point to make, which is a big structural question, is, and this has been noted around the world, which is especially young women are veering a lot more left. A lot more. Young men are going right, but nowhere to the same extent. So the question is, and Susan Lee said this in her first press conference, that she wants the Liberal Party to meet Australians where they are. But if the Liberal Party is meeting young women where they are, that necessarily means the Liberal Party is going to have to veer left. So these are big questions that I think go beyond just the Liberal Party has a women's problem.
Well, it is a recent phenomenon, isn't it, Zach? I mean, you pointed to Tony Abbott, but I mean, Menzies' Liberal Party was basically the party that women voted for, that young people voted for. It was the new progressive, female-friendly party. I mean, we were talking 1940s, so there weren't very many female candidates, but there were a few, and Enid Lyons, of course, was right there at the beginning.
Yeah, so 8 out of the first 10 women parliamentarians for the federal parliament were Liberal, and one of the other 2 was an independent Labor, wasn't even ALP. So the Liberals used to be very strong on this, and there's all sorts of discussions around the fact that Menzies in The Forgotten People talks about the home, whereas Labor was only talking about the workplace, and women had a place in the home. They felt represented. A lot of the John Henry Austral, all the advertising that they were doing around the 1949 campaign was very deliberately directed to women. But what I would say is that it's not just the Liberal Party that's failed. It is what John's talking about, these trends as far as women veering leftward, when it used to be quite the opposite. It used to be that women were more conservative. They were associated with the temperance movement and its attempts to restrict alcohol. A lot of the early suffragettes continue to be campaigners against abortion. Like, these progressive and conservative ideas, it's a whole cultural shift that's evolved over decades that's really hard for the Liberal Party to deal with. It's not a simple solution. And to think that the solution will be as simple as quotas rather than the policies and the actual believing in things, I think is a bit naive.
And there's another overlay, Georgina and Zach, which is, if you look at Trump's most recent election, he got a high proportion of young men and young women. When you're looking at reform as well, Nigel Farage is nearly as popular with women as he is with men. So there's a lot of different aspects to this debate about why women won't necessarily vote Liberal.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I would just say, as a woman, and I'm, the only one here, so I'm going to have my moment. Peter Dutton was pretty unpopular within my circle. I mean, people would say, oh, look, I don't like Albo, but Peter Dutton, ick. I mean, unfortunately, that was the
Well, can I ask you how
getting.
big was working from home policy for your circle?
I think that was it's very challenging to be told there's absolutely zero workplace flexibility when you are a working parent, by the way.
Even though that's not what Peter Dutton said, but that's how it was taken.
Yeah. No, I think, but it's being a parent, it's not being a woman or a man. That is being a parent. It's challenging. You're a parent. You want some flexibility in the workplace. So having politicians who get you is important, get your concerns. And I see what Susan Lee's trying to do with her early remarks is say, we're going to be the party that gets Middle Australia.
And that's good.
And that's good.
Because Labor gets Middle Australia. Labor gets that Australia likes more debt-funded government spending.
So we have a flood of questions and, of course, very few minutes in which to answer them. So I'm going to try and crack through these. We have the wonderful Stephen Wilkes. Hi, Stephen. Great that you've tuned in from Canberra. He's asked a very good question. Why did the Nats do, the National Party, do so relatively well? So they basically held their ground, didn't they? Are there any wider lessons?
Yeah, key question. One answer, the Nats have a strong brand.
Zach?
Yeah, I think particularly that they held up well against independence. And I think probably rural Australia still remembers what the 2010 Parliament was like and the betrayal that they had from independents who were often ex-Nats members who ended up to being very left when it came to their decisions, and they weren't about to get burned again.
Great. I hope that satisfied you, Stephen. Jeffrey Good. Hi, Jeffrey. He has asked, John mentioned proportional representation, which is used in some form by most nations, and which would have elected a House of about 35% Labor, 32% Coalition, 12% Greens, and 21% others. So why would such a proportional representation system not be a better result for the Coalition than the 29% of members of the House of Reps it now has?
Well, I think it would be. I mean, I think, and this is a fair way down the track and unlikely to ever happen, but a proportional representation system, I think, is a better reflection of the Australian people. If we're not going to do that, then one thing we should do, and the IPA, and I've advocated this for a long time, is actually increase the size of the House of Representatives. And that has many purposes, better representation at the local level, but then I think you get a degree of porousness and flexibility in the party system, and I think Australian politics will be better off for it. I don't know how you would get an increase in, the House can simply vote for it, but then what that does for Senate representation is going to be difficult. But I think these are the sorts of discussions we need to have.
Yeah, we have to increase the size of the Senate then, don't we? Because of the next,
you would.
Of course, it was a Menzies era referendum.
Yeah.
And Australian voters don't like doing that at a referendum.
No, don't want more politicians. But as a proportion of I think it's about 120,000 people per electorate. I mean, is that comparable to other?
No, it's some of the biggest electorates in the English-speaking world.
We have some of the most disciplined
Yes.
parties, despite that tradition of liberalism. But I would say that proportional representation is incredibly a rejection of all the British Westminster tradition, and I think Robert Menzies would be turning in his grave for us even suggesting.
A shout out to Alison Ringer. Hi, Alison. She's asked about the working from home comment and whether it negatively impacted the Liberal campaign. I think we can.
Well, one thing to add, and again, talking to my friend Graham Young in Queensland, who's done some qualitative exit polling on this, it hurt Dutton both ways. It hurt him when he announced, when Jane Hume announced the policy, although it technically wasn't a policy, it was more an intention. And then it hurt him again when he backflipped.
Yes,
so
flam.
He had the perception of being a hard, strong leader. And in fact, as soon as there was blowback against a policy, he walked away from it. He lost twice.
Holly Larkspur has asked two questions. One about The Voice, which I feel like we might have covered enough, but what about, so she says, you touched on political apathy and decreased voter turnout. I'm curious to what extent you think this was based on unattractive policies from the coalition or, I guess, other factors.
Oh, look, I'm not sure it's policies. I think it is as society is bifurcating, as we're becoming more intent on particular concerns, an increasing number of people don't feel they're represented by the political parties. I mean, again, as someone who believes in freedom of speech, the parties most committed to freedom of speech were Pauline Hanson's One Nation and the Libertarians. And I'm a 35-year Liberal Party member. I still voted Liberal, but the Liberal Party didn't speak to any of my concerns.
Zach, do you have a view on why people weren't turning out?
It'd be interesting to see the age breakdown, because I think it would be overwhelmingly young people, which speaks to not just a lack of civics education, but a lack of belief in the system itself, that the system can actually produce change. So why waste your Saturday morning if you don't think it's going to make a difference?
Commentary around the huge increase in voter enrolments this election. I think it was the largest increase. I mean, you sort of wonder about these things because we've just got a bigger population. We've got migrants, but is it young people being incentivised a bit more in the past? But then they might have signed up, enrolled to vote, but didn't quite get there on the day.
Well, the AEC does a very good job at getting people to enrol, but that's different from people turning up on Saturday or turning up for the 2 weeks basically that you had. And Zach made an important point about to a young person, does voting change anything? And this is a topic for another day. But what is the political system delivering to young people at the moment, if you were a young person, you would be pretty dissatisfied with both major parties.
Well, there is a question here from Saul Eastlake. Hi, Saul.
Hello, Saul.
All the way from Tassie. Great to have you on the website.
Now a solid Labor state.
Yes, 100% Labor seats in Tassie. Amazing.
I never thought Archer would ever be out of Parliament. That was one of the big shocks.
Yeah.
Because I know many Tasmanians. I was down campaigning during the Voice referendum, and Bridget Archer was everywhere, and she seemed to be liked and respected, if not loved. But even she couldn't withstand the swing.
Yeah, and what a swing it was. So Saul says, Xi Jinping has often said housing should be for living in, not for speculation. Do you think Menzies would have agreed?
Oh, this goes all the way back to sort of Henry George and like the real origins of Australian liberalism and something that united sort of the free traders and the early Liberal Party. But I think, yes, we have reached a point at which property is the asset that everyone invests in. And I think it's not just about the policy settings around housing policy and negative gearing that contributes to that. I think it speaks to the fact that we have such a stagnant economy, such a highly regulated, highly taxed economy, that nothing else is worth investing in other than just buying some land and waiting for inflation to go up enough that it's worth more. It's a really stagnant...
And immigration to push up those prices. So, Saul, I hear exactly what you're saying, but to go to Zach's point, and again, you talk to candidates who talk to people on the ground about this, housing and a second investment property is one of the few ways that a regular, normal person, a teacher or a cop or a tradie, can invest in something they understand. If we are to change the tax treatment of the residential home, of capital gains, of negative gearing, then I think it's a debate that we should have, but it has to be in an understanding that people have invested and planned on the basis of some degree of certainty. So I think there's a debate to be had about having this debate in an understanding, however, that this would provoke massive uncertainty and would probably kill any government attempting to do it.
Yeah. I mean, the share market has historically outperformed the housing market. So, if you're looking for a way to grow your wealth, you are better off, well, historically at least, putting your money in the share market. But as you say, I mean, there's this sort of sense, I don't really get it. I don't understand it. It looks a bit risky. Housing always goes up, 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 even if it's not going up as much. I just, there's always a share market crash around the corner, and yeah, there's a sense of nervousness. A question from another Robert Menzies Institute board member, the wonderful Dr. David Kemp. What can convince the Liberals to resume giving weight to the philosophy of the parties as articulated by Menzies?
Continual election defeats.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think Zach said something really interesting, and this cuts across what so many current Liberal MPs think. The Liberals are best when they do philosophy. Actually, when they talk about big things. So it's ironic. So the Labor Party presents itself as the party of intellectuals, but basically they're the party of spending money in a pretty narrow sense. And, well, not just spending money from future generations. It's the Liberal Party who are best at big ideas. But the paradox is it's those big ideas, the big cultural, social, economic debates that the Liberals shy away from and that we have forgotten about how to argue. So, David, it's wonderful to hear from you, but we're talking about the wets and the dries, about the Kemps and the Downers and the Hydes and the McLaughlins, and then on the other side the Puplicks and so on. None of that debate is taking place now. Liberals are afraid to engage in those debates, and I saw this firsthand when we first saw the attempts to regulate the media and censor the press some 20 years ago under Julia Gillard. It started to begin. The Liberal Party had basically no capacity to debate a simple principle like freedom of speech. They had lost the capacity to argue from first ideas.
I'm going to go to the next question because we've only got 3 minutes, but I'll throw it to you, Zach. From Duncan Buchanan. Hi, Duncan. Has the Liberal Party forgotten these people? I think by which he means the forgotten people, the middle class. Has it lost contact with its natural constituency? What should it do to win these people back? I mean, perhaps drawing on what John has just said.
Yeah, but I would say that the Liberal Party faces a problem because the teal seats are post-material. So the values of the forgotten people, the values of frugality and saving and earning your place in society and owning that little piece of earth, they're not going to appeal to the teal seats. They will appeal to outer suburbia, but you've got the historic legacy of all these people who for generations have voted Labor, who have this repugnance when they even hear the name Liberal. How you break through to them, it really is the sort of Rosetta Stone of speaking to Middle Australia that the Liberals haven't figured out at the moment. Howard was able to do it with the Battlers, so it can be done, but they need to do it even more now because of the Teals.
John?
But there's a huge resistance to that. And again, I saw this on the ground, knowing the candidates, and Daniel Wild, my colleague at the IPA, ran in the seat of Spence, a 12%, now a 14% Labor seat, a 70% no vote. There's also no Liberal infrastructure. Exactly as Zach said, these people have voted Labor for generations, understandably, and they've never seen a Liberal. And the Liberal vote in Spence was about 25%.
We are at the end of this Afternoon Light Live, so I'm going to use the final seconds to say a huge thank you to John Roskam for joining us here at the wild and wonderful campus of the University of Melbourne, here in the Robert Menzies Institute in the Old Quad, and to Zach, thank you as ever for your insights. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.